The stench of rot clung to the air like a second skin as Agent Tom Shepard stepped out of the government-issued black SUV and into the heart of 5 Points, New York City's most notorious slum. The narrow streets, wet with something more than just rain, seemed to ripple with an unseen energy. The buildings leaned toward each other, as if sharing secrets too ghastly for the living. It wasn't just the crime that made this place infamous. It was something older, something that gnawed at the bones of the city, never sated. "Welcome to hell," muttered Sully, his voice laced with gallows humor as he unloaded the paranormal equipment from the trunk. His breath misted in the frigid night air, forming patterns that danced like ghosts before vanishing into the blackness. Dr. Cassandra Reyes, the team's paranormal researcher, adjusted her glasses and scanned the decaying surroundings with a mix of fascination and dread. "Hell might be a step up," she quipped, her tone dry but her eyes wide with the possibilities of what they might encounter. "I've read about 5 Points in old police reports and folklore journals. This place has a reputation that predates even the worst gang wars. Their target, an ancient, crumbling tenement on the corner of Mulberry and Worth, a place locals avoided even in broad daylight. The building had a pulse, a living entity of wood, stone, and sin. The tenants spoke of whispering walls and shadowy figures that moved with purpose. They had all heard it, the voice. A voice that wasn't theirs, that didn't belong to anything that should be able to speak. The team made their way inside, their boots squelching on floors saturated with centuries of grime. The hallway was narrow and claustrophobic, the air thick with the scent of decay and something sweeter, like honey but wrong. It was the smell of death that had lingered too long. They set up their equipment in a dingy room on the second floor, the walls sagging under the weight of unspeakable horrors. Sully placed the infrared cameras at strategic points, while Cass fiddled with the EVP recorder, her hands trembling slightly. "Ready to catch ourselves a ghost?" Sully joked, trying to lighten the mood, but his voice echoed strangely, like it didn't belong there. Suddenly, the temperature dropped. The breath they exhaled hung in the air like a frozen fog. Shepard's hand instinctively went to the gun holstered at his side, though he knew it was useless against whatever they were dealing with. And then the whispering began. At first, it was faint, like the wind through the cracks in the walls, but soon it grew louder, more insistent. The words were garbled, as if the speaker had a mouth full of dirt, but one thing was clear: they were not welcome. "Do you hear that?" Cass's voice was barely a whisper as she activated the EVP recorder. "Hear it?" "I can feel it," Sully replied, his usually steady hands now trembling. The whispering grew louder, more frenzied, like a chorus of the damned. It filled the room, reverberating off the walls, making the very air hum with malevolence. Shepard's instincts screamed at him to leave, but they had a job to do. He motioned for the team to follow him as he moved toward the source of the noise, a wall at the end of the hallway. Cass approached cautiously, her recorder held out in front of her like a shield. The whispering intensified, the words now discernible. "Get out! Get out! Get out!" The wall began to pulse, the wood buckling as if something on the other side was trying to break through. Shepard's heart pounded in his chest as he drew his weapon. Not that it would do much good against whatever was causing this, but it made him feel better. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the whispering stopped. The hallway was plunged into an eerie silence, the kind that made your ears ring and your heart race. Without warning, the wall exploded outward, sending splinters and dust into the air. The team staggered back, covering their faces. As the debris settled, they saw it, a shadowy figure, its form barely human, standing in the gaping hole where the wall once was. It looked at them with hollow eyes, its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. And then it lunged. Sully's reflexes kicked in as the shadowy figure lunged, and he hit the floor just in time to avoid its sweeping, claw-like appendages. The thing moved with an unnatural speed, more like a glitch in reality than a living creature. It was made of pure darkness, an absence of light that seemed to suck the very life out of the air around it. "Fall back!" Shepard shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the overwhelming presence of the creature. He fired his weapon, the muzzle flashes illuminating the room in brief, strobe-like bursts. The bullets passed through the entity, leaving ripples in the darkness, but doing no real harm. Cass scrambled backward, her mind racing. "It's not physical. We need to..." Her words were cut off as the creature turned its attention to her, its hollow eyes locking onto her like a predator on prey. Shepard unloaded his entire magazine into the thing, but it was like trying to fight smoke. The creature moved closer, its body expanding, tendrils of shadow stretching out to engulf them. Cass fumbled with her bag, pulling out a small vial of holy water. In one swift motion, she hurled it at the creature. The vial shattered against its form, and for a moment, the darkness recoiled, hissing like steam. The room filled with a blinding light as the creature shrieked, a sound so high-pitched it rattled their teeth and filled their skulls with pain. "Move. Now," Shepard barked, grabbing Cass by the arm and pulling her toward the door. Sully was already ahead of them, darting through the debris-strewn hallway. As they burst out of the building, the door slammed shut behind them with a force that shook the ground. They tumbled into the street, gasping for breath, the cold air burning their lungs. What the hell was that? Sully wheezed, his eyes wide with fear. His usual bravado had been stripped away, leaving only raw terror. "A shadow man," Cass replied, her voice trembling, "but not like any I've ever read about. It was stronger, more tangible. And it was angry." "Angry?" Shepard repeated, wiping sweat from his brow. "Try murderous. That thing wasn't just a ghost. It was something else, something much worse." The streets around them were silent, the slums seemingly undisturbed by the horrors they had just encountered. It was as if the rest of the city was oblivious to the malevolent force lurking within the crumbling walls of 5 Points. "We need to regroup," Shepard said, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at him. "This isn't just a haunting. It's a full-blown manifestation of something ancient, something that wants to tear this place apart." As they walked back to their SUV, the whispers started again, faint but unmistakable. They came from the very walls of the buildings around them, from the ground beneath their feet, from the air itself. "Get out! Get out! Get out!" But they were in too deep now. Whatever was haunting 5 Points wasn't going to let them leave easily. And Shepard knew they couldn't turn back. Not with the slum, and possibly the entire city, at stake. "We need more firepower," he muttered, glancing at his empty gun with frustration. "And a hell of a lot more holy water." Cass nodded, her mind already racing with possible countermeasures. "And we need to find out what triggered this. Something set this thing loose, and we need to figure out what it was before it's too late." As they drove away from the cursed tenement, the shadow of 5 Points loomed over them, growing darker and more oppressive with every passing moment. The battle had only just begun. The drive back to headquarters was heavy with unspoken dread. Shepard gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white as he navigated the dark, twisting streets of New York City. Cass sat in the back seat, her laptop open, the screen casting a ghostly glow on her face as she furiously typed. Sully, usually the one to break the tension with a joke or a snide remark, was uncharacteristically silent, staring out the window, lost in thought. "Cass, what are you digging up?" Shepard finally asked, breaking the uneasy silence. "Trying to find anything on shadow men," she replied, not looking up from the screen. "But everything I'm reading doesn't match what we encountered. This wasn't just a ghost. It was something else. Something ancient, like it didn't belong in this world." Shepard nodded grimly. "And it's only going to get worse if we don't figure this out. We need to understand what we're dealing with, where it came from. There's a lot of old folklore about 5 Points," Cass continued. "Before it became a slum, it was a burial ground. Unmarked graves, paupers' graves, bodies stacked on bodies. Some say it was cursed land from the start. Others claim that something was awakened when the area was dug up to build the tenements. And then there's this." Her voice trailed off as she clicked on a link. "What?" Sully asked, turning to face her. During the 1800s, there were reports of a cult operating out of 5 Points. They called themselves the Children of Shadow. They believed in something called the Endless Dark, a being or force that they worshipped through rituals and sacrifices. According to what I'm reading, they performed these rituals in hidden catacombs beneath the city. Shepard glanced at her in the rearview mirror, a chill running down his spine. You think what we saw was connected to this cult? I think it's more than possible, Cass replied. If those rituals were powerful enough, they could have left behind something lingering, something that's been growing in strength over the centuries, feeding off the misery and death in the area. Jesus, Sully muttered. And here I thought our job couldn't get any worse. We need to find those catacombs, Shepard said, his voice resolute. If that thing is tied to them, it's our best shot at stopping it. The SUV pulled up to their headquarters, an unassuming brick building tucked away in a quiet part of the city. The team filed inside, their usual banter replaced by a tense silence. They gathered in the dimly lit operations room, the walls lined with monitors displaying live feeds from various haunted locations around the city. Cass spread out old maps of 5 Points on the table, tracing her finger along the faded lines. These catacombs were supposed to be sealed off when the city expanded, but there might be a way to access them through the sewers. If the cult was real, they would have kept it hidden, somewhere no one would think to look. So we're going sewer diving? Sully asked, raising an eyebrow. Great. Can't wait to see what kind of lovely surprises are waiting for us down there. Shepard leaned over the maps, his eyes scanning the lines intently. If we can find the entrance, we can trace it back to the source of this darkness. We need to gather everything we've got: infrared cameras, thermal imaging, EMF detectors, and enough holy water to flood a river. Cass nodded, her mind already racing with plans. We should also prepare for more than just ghosts. If that cult was summoning something, it could have brought other things with it, creatures that aren't bound by the same rules as spirits. Shepard straightened up, a steely determination in his eyes. We'll head out first thing tomorrow. Tonight, get some rest. We're going to need it. As the team dispersed, the weight of the task ahead hung over them like a dark cloud. They had faced many horrors in their line of work, but this was different. This was older, darker, something that had been festering for centuries, waiting for the right moment to strike. In the silence of the night, as they tried to find some semblance of sleep, the whispers returned, soft, insistent, and filled with malice. The slum was calling to them, and they knew there was no turning back. Morning arrived with a sky the color of bruised flesh, the sun struggling to pierce through the thick clouds that clung to the city like a shroud. The team gathered in the operations room, their faces etched with the weariness of a sleepless night. The air was thick with anticipation, a tension that buzzed just below the surface. Shepard, dressed in tactical gear, checked his equipment one last time. Everyone ready? As ready as I'll ever be to crawl through a sewer, Sully replied, strapping a flashlight to his belt. His usual humor had returned, but there was an edge to it, a sign of the anxiety bubbling beneath his bravado. Cass had swapped her usual academic attire for a more practical outfit: combat boots, cargo pants, and a utility vest packed with tools. I've got everything we might need, she said, patting the bag slung over her shoulder. EMF detectors, thermal cameras, EVP recorders, and enough batteries to power a small city. And the holy water? Shepard asked. 3 flasks, she replied, pulling one out to show him. Plus, I've got a few other things I've been working on, experimental, but worth a shot. Shepard nodded, appreciating her thoroughness. Let's get this done. The drive back to 5 Points was uneventful, the city slowly waking up as they navigated through the morning traffic. But as they approached the slum, the atmosphere shifted. The buildings loomed closer, the streets narrower, as if the very city was trying to squeeze them out. They parked near the entrance to an old, disused sewer, the metal grate rusted and partially hidden by overgrown weeds. Shepard and Sully pried it open, the screeching of metal against stone echoing down the dark tunnel like a scream. Ladies first, Sully quipped, but the joke fell flat in the oppressive silence. One by one, they descended into the abyss, their flashlights cutting through the inky blackness. The air was thick with the stench of decay and something else, something ancient and foul that clung to the walls like a miasma. The tunnel stretched on, the sound of their footsteps swallowed by the darkness. The only sound was the drip of water and the distant, echoing whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "This place is a labyrinth," Cass whispered, her voice barely audible over the growing sense of dread. "If those catacombs are down here, they could be anywhere." "Stay close," Shepard ordered, his hand resting on his weapon. "We don't want to get separated." As they moved deeper into the sewer, the walls began to change. The brickwork gave way to older, rougher stone, the passages narrowing and twisting in unnatural ways. The air grew colder, their breath misting in the flashlight beams. Cass's EMF detector began to spike, the readings erratic and intense. "We're close," she said, her voice tinged with both excitement and fear. "There's something here, something powerful." They rounded a corner and found themselves in a large, open chamber. The walls were lined with ancient symbols, carved deep into the stone. In the center of the room stood a stone altar, stained with something dark and dried. It was a place of worship, a place of sacrifice. "This must be it," Shepard said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The cult's ritual chamber." The atmosphere in the room was oppressive, the air thick with the residue of countless dark rituals. It felt as though the shadows themselves were watching, waiting for them to make a move. As they approached the altar, the temperature plummeted. The shadows in the room began to shift and move, coalescing into forms that defied logic and reason. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling their minds with a cacophony of voices. Sully's flashlight flickered, then went out. Guys," he said, his voice shaking. Before anyone could react, the shadows attacked. The darkness erupted with malevolent force, tendrils of shadow lashing out like living whips. Shepard instinctively raised his arm, but the shadows passed through his flesh, leaving a biting cold in their wake. Sully cursed, dropping his useless flashlight and drawing his sidearm. He fired blindly into the darkness, the muzzle flash illuminating the writhing forms for mere seconds, revealing faces twisted in silent agony. "Move," Shepard shouted, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of whispers. The team scattered, each member trying to evade the relentless assault. Cass, clutching her EMF detector in one hand and a flask of holy water in the other, frantically scanned the room for any sign of an exit. The shadows seemed to anticipate their every move, blocking their path with shifting walls of darkness. "We can't fight them like this," Cass yelled, her voice strained. "They're feeding off the darkness, off the history here. Then we change the game," Shepard roared back. "Sully, light it up." Sully didn't hesitate. From his pack, he pulled out a flare gun, quickly loading it and aiming at the center of the chamber. With a deafening whoosh, the flare shot out, its brilliant red light flooding the room with an otherworldly glow. The shadows recoiled, hissing like scalded beasts as the light cut through their forms. "Now," Shepard commanded, and the team charged toward the altar in the brief reprieve. The flare's light revealed a narrow passage hidden behind a collapsed wall, its entrance barely wide enough for them to squeeze through. One by one, they scrambled into the tunnel, the flare sputtering as its light began to fade. Sully was the last to enter, firing another flare back into the chamber to buy them more time. The shadows screamed, a sound that resonated deep within their bones. But the team pressed on, moving as fast as they could through the claustrophobic passage. The tunnel twisted and turned, its walls seeming to close in around them. The air grew thicker with every step, carrying with it the scent of rot and something far worse, despair. The whispers had followed them into the tunnel, now louder and more distinct. They spoke of pain, betrayal, and promises broken. Finally, the tunnel opened up into a cavernous space, the ceiling lost in shadow. In the center of the room stood a stone pedestal, and upon it, a blood-red book bound in leather, its pages glowing with a sinister light. Cass approached it cautiously, her eyes wide with both fear and curiosity. "This must be the source," she whispered, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch the book. The cult's grimoire. It's ancient, older than the city itself. "Don't touch it," Shepard barked, grabbing her wrist. "We don't know what it's capable of." But it was too late. The moment her fingers brushed the cover, the room exploded with energy. The shadows surged forth from the tunnel, their forms no longer indistinct but clearly visible, humanoid, with eyes like burning coals and claws that dripped with blood. "Run!" Shepard screamed, but there was nowhere to go. The tunnel behind them had sealed itself shut, trapping them in the heart of the cult's domain. The shadows descended upon them, their forms twisting into grotesque caricatures of the human shape. Cass fell to her knees, the book clutched to her chest, as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded in reality. "We're not going to make it out of here," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the deafening roar of the shadows. But Shepard wasn't ready to give up. He grabbed the book from Cass, flipping through its pages frantically. The text was in a language he couldn't understand, the symbols shifting and changing before his eyes. But one page caught his attention, a sigil surrounded by a circle of runes. This is a binding spell, he realized, hope sparking in his chest. "We can trap them here, but we have to act fast." He handed the book to Cass, who, despite her fear, began to chant the incantation inscribed on the page. The shadows howled, sensing what was about to happen. They surged forward, desperate to stop her, but Shepard and Sully formed a protective circle around her, their weapons ready. As Cass continued to chant, the air in the room grew thicker, charged with an unnatural energy. The shadows writhed and twisted, their forms beginning to dissipate as the spell took hold. The ground beneath them trembled, cracks forming in the stone as the sigil glowed brighter and brighter. With one final, desperate push, Cass finished the incantation, her voice breaking as the last word left her lips. The sigil on the ground erupted in light, the shadows screaming as they were pulled into the circle, their forms breaking apart into wisps of smoke. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, with a deafening crack, the room imploded, the force of the spell collapsing the tunnel behind them and sealing them inside. Darkness enveloped the team as they struggled to regain their senses. The air was thick with dust, and the oppressive silence was broken only by the sound of their labored breathing. Shepard coughed, pushing debris off his chest as he sat up, his body aching from the force of the collapse. "Everyone still alive?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Cass groaned, her hand clutching her head where a nasty gash was bleeding. "Barely. What the hell just happened?" "You finished the spell," Sully answered, helping her to her feet. "But it looks like the whole damn place came down around us." Shepard surveyed their surroundings, his heart sinking as he realized the severity of their situation. The chamber they were in had collapsed, the tunnel they'd entered through now completely blocked by tons of rock and debris. They were trapped, buried alive in the heart of 5 Points. But there was something else, a faint glow emanating from the pedestal where the book had been. The light was weak, but it was enough to reveal a set of stairs leading deeper into the earth. "Looks like we're not done yet," Shepard said, nodding towards the stairs. "If we're getting out of here, it's the only way." Sully chuckled darkly, the sound devoid of humor. "Down into the pit. Why am I not surprised?" The stairs were ancient, each step slick with moisture and treacherous with age. The deeper they descended, the colder the air became, until their breath was visible in front of them. The whispers returned, louder now, filling the tunnel with their mournful song. "Do you hear that?" Cass asked, her voice trembling. "It's like crying." They all heard it, soft, pained sobs echoing from the depths. The sound grew louder as they reached the bottom of the stairs, stepping into a massive underground chamber. The walls were lined with skeletons, their bones fused into the stone, as if they had been absorbed into the very fabric of the place. In the center of the room was a pool of black water, the surface rippling as if disturbed by an unseen force. The sobbing was louder here, emanating from the water itself. As they approached, the water began to churn, and a figure emerged from its depths. It was a woman, her skin pale and translucent, her eyes hollow and filled with sorrow. She wore a tattered gown, her hair floating around her like a dark halo. She was beautiful and terrifying, a ghostly queen of the underworld. "Who are you?" Shepard demanded, though his voice was tinged with fear. The woman looked at them with eyes that held centuries of pain. "I am the last of the children of shadow," she whispered, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "I was their queen, their priestess. I led them to their doom." Her form began to flicker, her sorrowful expression contorting into one of rage. "And now you shall join them." The pool began to boil, the water turning crimson as the skeletons along the walls began to stir, their bones creaking as they came to life. The room filled with the sound of clattering bones and the echoing cries of the damned. "We need to move now," Shepard shouted, backing away from the pool as the skeletons began to rise. They moved with unnatural speed, their bony fingers reaching out to grasp the living. Cass fumbled with her gear, pulling out the last flask of holy water. She hurled it at the ghostly queen, the glass shattering on impact. The water hissed as it touched her ethereal form, causing her to scream in agony. The skeletons faltered, their movements becoming sluggish. "Go!" Shepard ordered, and they ran, the narrow passageway at the far end of the chamber their only hope. The ground shook as they sprinted towards it, the queen's screams echoing behind them, filled with fury and despair. They dove into the passageway just as the chamber began to collapse, the tunnel sealing itself behind them. The last thing they heard was the queen's final, mournful wail as the darkness swallowed her whole. The passageway twisted and turned, a labyrinth carved deep beneath the cursed ground of 5 Points. Each step was a venture into the unknown, the walls closing in around them as if they were moving through the very bowels of the earth. The air grew thinner, colder, and the whispers never ceased. They slithered through the darkness, a language of the dead that gnawed at the edges of sanity. Sully's flashlight flickered, casting fleeting shadows on the uneven walls. "This place feels like it's alive," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the sound of dripping water. "I think it is," Cass replied, her hand trailing along the wall, feeling the slight pulsation beneath her fingertips. "This tunnel, it's like a vein feeding something deep below." Shepard gritted his teeth, determined to stay focused. "We keep moving until we find a way out. This place is trying to break us, but we won't give it the satisfaction." The passage opened up suddenly, revealing a cavernous space that took their breath away. The ceiling was lost in darkness, but the floor was illuminated by a sickly green glow emanating from the ground. As their eyes adjusted, they realized the glow came from countless bones arranged in intricate patterns, forming a macabre cityscape. "Dear God," Sully breathed, "it's a burial ground, an entire city of the dead." The bones weren't just scattered. They had been meticulously placed, creating streets, buildings, and even figures that seemed to stare at them with hollow eyes. In the center of the bone city stood a massive structure, a cathedral made entirely of skulls. Its spire reached upwards, piercing the darkness like a dagger. "This isn't just a burial ground," Cass whispered, her voice trembling. "It's a monument, a tribute to something ancient. Or someone," Shepard added grimly. His instincts told him that whatever lay at the heart of this twisted city was the source of the evil that plagued 5 Points. They had to destroy it, or they would never escape. They approached the cathedral with trepidation, their footsteps echoing through the empty streets of bone. The entrance was flanked by 2 enormous skulls, their jaws open as if in eternal scream. Inside, the green light pulsed with a heartbeat rhythm, emanating from an altar in the center of the room. On the altar lay a figure, wrapped in decayed robes, its face obscured by a mask of bone. As they drew closer, the figure began to stir, its head turning slowly towards them. The air grew thick with the stench of decay, and a low growl reverberated through the cathedral. Cass gasped, clutching Shepard's arm. That's not possible. The figure sat up, its movements slow and deliberate. It was a man, or at least had been centuries ago. His eyes were hollow pits, his skin stretched taut over his skeletal frame. But it was the mask that sent chills down their spines. A mask of pure bone, shaped into a grotesque parody of a human face, with fangs that protruded from the mouth. "I am the architect of this city," the figure rasped, its voice like the grinding of stones. "And you have trespassed in my domain." The walls of the cathedral began to close in, the bones shifting and grinding against each other. The city of bones outside seemed to come alive. The figures they had thought were statues now moving, rising from their positions and advancing towards the cathedral. Shepard didn't hesitate. "We need to destroy that altar. Now." Sully aimed his rifle at the altar, but before he could fire, the architect raised a hand, and the bones on the floor shot up, forming a barrier. Sully's bullets ricocheted off the bones harmlessly, the sound echoing through the chamber. Cass screamed as the figures outside began to pound on the cathedral doors, their skeletal hands clawing at the bone walls. The architect stood, towering over them, his mask gleaming in the green light. "You cannot destroy what has been built on the foundation of the damned," he intoned. "Your souls will join those of my children, and together we will rise again." Shepard's mind raced as the bone city outside clamored to enter, the relentless pounding growing louder with each passing second. He knew they were running out of time. The architect's twisted form was a grotesque reminder of the horrors that had taken root in this cursed place, and it was clear that they had underestimated the power that held sway over 5 Points. "There has to be a way to stop him," Cass shouted, her voice trembling with fear and desperation. "The altar, it's the source of his power, but we can't get to it," Sully snapped, reloading his rifle as he backed away from the advancing architect. "That bone barrier is impenetrable." Shepard's eyes darted around the cathedral, searching for anything they could use. The architect moved with eerie calmness, as if relishing the inevitability of their doom. The pounding at the doors grew more frantic, and the figures outside began to break through, their skeletal hands reaching into the cathedral. "We need to break the connection," Shepard realized aloud. "The bones, they're tied to him, but they're also part of this place. If we disrupt the pattern, maybe we can weaken his hold." "How do we do that?" Cass asked, panic rising in her voice. "We don't have time." Shepard's gaze fell on the spire above them. It was made entirely of skulls, each one placed with meticulous precision. The spire, it's the keystone. If we can bring it down, the entire structure might collapse. Sully nodded grimly. "Worth a shot, but how do we bring down something like that?" Cass fumbled with her gear, pulling out a small explosive charge. "This isn't much, but it might be enough to destabilize the structure. If we place it at the base of the spire..." "There's no time to argue," Shepard interrupted. "Do it." As Cass prepared the charge, the architect raised his arms, and the bones in the walls began to shift, closing in on them. The figures outside broke through, their hollow eyes fixed on the intruders. Sully fired at the nearest one, but the bullets did little to slow its advance. "Hurry, Cass," Shepard urged, his voice strained. The walls were closing in, and the architect's laughter echoed through the cathedral. Cass finished setting the charge and scrambled back. "Get down!" she shouted, pressing the detonator. The explosion was deafening, and the spire trembled as the base of it shattered. The bones above them groaned as the structure began to collapse, the skulls cracking and falling from their positions. The architect howled in rage, his form flickering as the bones beneath him shifted. The barrier around the altar crumbled, and Shepard seized the opportunity, charging forward and knocking the altar over with all his strength. The green light sputtered and died, and the figures outside the cathedral collapsed into heaps of bones. The architect staggered, his form losing coherence as the cathedral fell apart around him. "You cannot destroy what has been," The architect's voice trailed off as his form disintegrated into dust, the mask falling to the ground with a final hollow thud. The team scrambled for the exit as the cathedral collapsed behind them, the bone city crumbling into nothingness. They emerged into the passageway, battered and bruised but alive. As they staggered into the dim light of the tunnel, Shepard turned to Cass and Sully. "We're not out of this yet, but we've taken down one of their biggest weapons." Cass nodded, though her face was pale. "But there's still the curse, the evil that infests this place." Shepard set his jaw. "We'll find a way. We've come too far to turn back now." The tunnel stretched before them, dark and foreboding, but they had a renewed sense of purpose. They had taken down the architect, but the true source of the curse, the evil at the heart of 5 Points, was still waiting for them, and they would face it together. The team pressed forward, their every step echoing through the labyrinthine tunnels beneath 5 Points. Each breath was laced with dread as they approached the unknown. The death of the architect had only been a temporary victory, a mere shift in the balance of the unspeakable evil that had gripped the slum for centuries. The tunnel led them to a colossal underground chamber, a cavern so vast it seemed to breathe. The walls pulsed with a dark, throbbing energy that made the hair on their necks stand on end. The air was thick with the stench of decay, mixed with a strange metallic scent that hinted at blood. In the center of the chamber was a pit, wide and bottomless, a yawning abyss that seemed to draw in all light and hope. It was surrounded by stone pillars, each one etched with ancient runes that glowed with an unnatural light. The pit was the source of the malevolence that tainted the air, a chasm to something beyond human understanding. Cass took a step back, her face pale. This is the source, the heart of it all. Shepard felt the oppressive weight of the place bearing down on him. "It's a gateway," he said, his voice hollow, "a doorway to something beyond our world." Sully approached the edge cautiously, peering into the inky blackness. "I can feel it. It's like it's alive." "More than alive," a voice echoed from the shadows. It was deep, guttural, and carried with it the weight of ages. From the darkness emerged a figure, its form shifting and indistinct, as if it were woven from the shadows themselves. The figure was tall, almost inhumanly so, with a face obscured by a hood that seemed to be made of swirling darkness. Its eyes glowed with a cold, unnatural light that pierced through the gloom. "I am the warden of the abyss," the figure intoned, its voice reverberating through the chamber. "I have guarded this gateway for centuries, feeding it with the souls of the damned. You have come far, but your journey ends here." Shepard raised his weapon, but the warden merely laughed, a sound that sent chills down their spines. "Your weapons are useless against me, mortals. You cannot kill what is not alive." Cass clutched the talisman around her neck, the one they had recovered from the architect's cathedral. "There has to be a way to close the gateway," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. "The pillars," Sully suggested, his voice tense. "They're holding the gate open. If we can destroy them." The warden seemed to read their thoughts. With a wave of his hand, the pit began to churn, and from its depths emerged twisted figures, crawlers, skinwalkers, shadow men, all of them moving with a terrifying purpose toward the team. "Hold them off," Shepard barked, moving toward the nearest pillar. "Cass, Sully, get to the others. We bring these down, or we're finished." Sully fired at the advancing horde, but his bullets did little more than slow them down. Cass focused on the runes, feeling the dark energy pulsing through them. She pulled out another explosive charge and set it at the base of the pillar. The warden moved with inhuman speed, appearing beside Cass in an instant. His hand shot out, grabbing her by the throat. "You dare defy me, child of light?" Shepard tackled the warden, but the impact was like hitting solid stone. He was thrown back, hitting the ground hard. The warden tightened his grip on Cass, lifting her off the ground. Sully saw his chance and fired a shot at the pillar's base, where Cass had placed the explosive. The explosion rocked the chamber, and the pillar cracked, the runes flickering and dying. The warden roared in anger, dropping Cass as the chamber began to shake. "You fools! You know not what you have unleashed. The ground beneath them began to crack, the pit expanding as the gateway grew unstable. Shepard struggled to his feet, grabbing Cass and pulling her away from the collapsing pillar. "We need to take down the rest before the whole place comes down on us," Shepard yelled, the chaos around them growing more intense by the second. The warden, though weakened, wasn't done yet. He summoned more creatures from the abyss, and the battle raged on. But with each pillar they destroyed, the gateway weakened, the dark energy growing more volatile. Finally, with the last pillar destroyed, the pit began to collapse in on itself, the portal to the abyss closing. The warden screamed in fury, his form dissipating as the gateway sealed shut. The chamber shuddered violently, and the team ran for their lives as the ceiling began to cave in. They barely made it out of the tunnel before the entire underground complex collapsed, burying the evil forever beneath the streets of 5 Points. They emerged into the night, bruised, bloodied, but alive. The cursed energy that had permeated the slum was gone, and for the first time, the air felt clear. Shepard looked at his team, their faces a mix of relief and exhaustion. "We did it. We stopped it." Cass nodded, still catching her breath. But at what cost? Sully looked back at the ruined street, the memory of the horrors they had faced still fresh. "We saved lives tonight, but the scars, they'll stay with us." They walked away from the ruins, knowing they had faced something far beyond the realm of the living, and survived. But they also knew that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed.